They expected racial hatred. They were prepared for slurs, for mockery, for the contempt they had been taught all Westerners held for Asian people. But when American guards at Camp McCoy deliberately tried speaking Japanese and showing respect for their culture, the psychological shock was unbearable. This wasn't the brutality they had braced for. It was a subtle, sophisticated warfare that attacked the very core of their identity, and it left them emotionally shattered. The Wisconsin wind carried more than just the biting cold of early 1945. It carried the faint, hesitant sounds of a psychological revolution. Inside the barbed wire confines of Camp McCoy, a young American guard, his face a map of freckles and Midwestern earnestness, slowly approached a group of Japanese prisoners. He clutched a small notebook, his knuckles white. He stopped, cleared his throat, and with a painstaking accent that mangled the vowels but preserved the intent, he spoke. "Ohayo gozaimasu," he said. Good morning. The Japanese prisoners, hardened veterans of the Pacific Campaign, did not respond with words. They responded with a silence so profound, so thick with disbelief, that it seemed to swallow the very sound of the wind. One of them, a sergeant named Akira Tanaka, felt his knees weaken. This was not part of the script. The enemy was not supposed to know their language. The enemy was not supposed to try. In that single, mispronounced greeting, the entire architecture of their conditioning began to tremble. The Americans, they were beginning to understand, were not just fighting a war of bullets. They were fighting a war of souls, and their most devastating weapon was a simple phrasebook. To comprehend the cataclysmic shock of an American soldier speaking Japanese, one must first inhabit the psychological world of the Imperial Japanese soldier. Their indoctrination was not merely political. It was racial, cultural, and deeply spiritual. From the moment they donned the uniform, they were immersed in a doctrine of inherent Japanese superiority, a concept known as Yamato Damashi, the unique, indivisible, and supreme Japanese spirit. This was not abstract patriotism. It was a visceral belief that their very bloodline, their connection to the emperor, and their ancient culture made them spiritually and morally superior to other races. Westerners, and Americans in particular, were painted with a broad brush of contempt. They were Keto, hairy barbarians, a term that conveyed both physical revulsion and cultural disdain. Political officers, the Kempeitai military police, and a constant stream of state-controlled media depicted Americans as individualistic to the point of narcissism, materialistic to the point of spiritual emptiness, and weak-willed because they valued their own lives above the collective good. The American fighting man, they were told, was a coward who would break under pressure, a brute who fought for money, not honor, and a racist who held a special, venomous hatred for the yellow peril of Asia. Sergeant Akira Tanaka, before his capture at Guadalcanal, had been a literature student at Kyoto University. He was a man of words, of subtlety. He loved the delicate brush strokes of calligraphy, the layered, resonant meanings of haiku, the way the Japanese language itself could contain entire worlds of unspoken understanding in a single syllable. In the jungle as men fell to disease and shellfire around him, he had comforted his homesick men by reciting poetry under his breath, the ancient words, a fragile talisman against the overwhelming horror. When a grenade blast left him wounded, isolated, and finally captured, his greatest fear was not death, but the desecration of this inner world. He expected the Americans to tear his tattered book of Basho's poetry from his hands, to stomp on it, to laugh at the beautiful, intricate characters they were too primitive to comprehend. This expectation was his psychological shield. He had built a fortress in his mind, preparing for an enemy who would confirm his worst fears. But How does one defend against a foe who, instead of tearing the book from your hands, asks you with a frustrating, genuine curiosity what the words mean? The very foundation of his mental fortress was not just being tested, it was being offered a cup of tea. The initial forays into this cultural no man's land were not verbal, but gestural. For weeks, the camp had operated on a system of grunts, points, and universal gestures of command. But then, the subtle shift began. It started with a guard, a lanky Texan named Private David Miller, who noticed an older Japanese prisoner, a man in his 40s named Isao, struggling to tie a knot with an injured hand. Isao's fingers, stiff with old arthritis and a fresh shrapnel wound, fumbled with the rope, his frustration growing with each failed attempt. The other guards would have shouted, "Hayaku!" faster, or simply shoved him aside. But Miller approached differently. He did not speak. He simply held up his own two hands, mimed the act of tying, and looked at Isao with a questioning expression. His eyes calm. Isao, his body tensed like a spring, expecting a trick or a blow, nodded slowly, his own eyes wary. Miller then proceeded to slowly, deliberately, demonstrate a more effective, one-handed knot he had learned on his father's ranch. It was a simple, practical gesture, devoid of any obvious emotion. But to Isao and the other prisoners watching, it was revolutionary. The enemy was not just maintaining order, he was teaching. He was transmitting knowledge, a sacred act in any culture. This was not hatred. This was a form of recognition, a silent admission that the prisoner before him was a person capable of learning. Then came the incident with the snow. A severe blizzard had hit Wisconsin, piling drifts high against the barracks, transforming the camp into a monochrome landscape of white and gray. A work detail of Japanese prisoners was assigned to clear the paths. Among them was a young private, Kenji, who had been a fisherman from a small coastal village on the Sea of Japan. He had never seen snow before, only the violent storms of the sea. The substance fascinated and defeated him. It was both lighter and heavier than he expected, and he struggled with the heavy, unfamiliar shovel, his movements inefficient and exhausting. He caught the eye of a guard, Corporal James, a man with a perpetually stern expression and a chiseled jaw that seemed carved from granite. Kenji braced for a shouted reprimand for his inefficiency, his body automatically curling inwards. Instead, Corporal James walked over, his boots crunching in the snow. He wordlessly took the shovel from Kenji's hands. Then, with a few powerful, efficient motions that spoke of a lifetime of practical labor, he demonstrated how to use his legs and body weight, how to pivot at the waist, how to toss the snow in a fluid arc rather than trying to lift it with his arms. He then handed the shovel back. There was no smile, no pat on the back, no attempt at camaraderie. But there was also no contempt. It was a pure transfer of skill, one human to another, across the vast chasm of war, nationality, and language. Kenji took the shovel back, his mind reeling. The act was so devoid of the expected malice that it left him psychologically disarmed. These nonverbal exchanges created a cognitive dissonance that was quietly eroding the prisoner's certainty. The Americans were not behaving like the mindless, hate-filled brutes of propaganda. They were problem solvers. They were pragmatists. They were, in their own strange way, occasionally even helpful. This was the fertile ground, tilled by unexpected competence, in which the first seeds of language would be planted. The prisoners' minds, once sealed tight against the enemy with the iron of ideology, were now, just slightly, ajar. They had been disarmed by a quiet display of capability, and now they were vulnerable to something far more dangerous, attempted understanding. The stage was set for a psychological assault, far more effective than any interrogation. The official beginning of the language program was announced not with a trumpet blast, but with a simple typewritten notice, posted in both English and clumsy kanji on the camp bulletin board. Voluntary English instruction. Evening classes. Barracks 7. Instructor. Professor J. Evans. The reaction among the prisoners was a mixture of simmering curiosity, deep suspicion, and outright hostility. The diehards, a faction led by a fanatical lieutenant named Sato, declared it a transparent trap. "They want to learn our weaknesses," Sato hissed in the barracks that night, his voice a low, fervent whisper that cut through the dark. "They will use our own words to confuse us, to plant doubts, to extract information. They will learn how we think and then use it to twist our minds. Anyone who attends is a traitor to the emperor and to Japan." His words carried weight. He was a known veteran of Nanking, a man whose fanaticism was burnished by bloodshed. Sergeant Tanaka, however, felt a different, more dangerous pull. His academic mind, long suppressed by the brutal pragmatism of war, was intrigued. How would these Americans approach the language? What would they emphasize, military commands or something else? His curiosity, a part of himself he thought the jungle had suffocated, began to stir like a dormant seed. He decided he would go, not as a collaborator, but as a spy, to understand this new American tactic. The first class was a tense, awkward affair. A dozen prisoners showed up, sitting rigidly on the backless wooden benches, their postures screaming defiance and apprehension. The instructor was not a military man, but a civilian, Professor Joseph Evans, a quiet, bespectacled man in his 50s, who had been a linguistics professor at the University of Chicago before the war. He had a calm, unhurried demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the jangling energy of the military guards. He did not begin with commands or threats. He walked to the small blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and with a steady hand wrote 2 words, "Hello," and beneath it, its rough phonetic equivalent in Japanese characters, "Konnichiwa." He turned to the room, his eyes scanning the impassive faces, and said slowly and clearly, "Hello." Then he pointed to the Japanese script and looked at the prisoners expectantly. A long, heavy silence followed. The air was thick with unspoken defiance. Finally, a prisoner in the back, muttering under his breath as if uttering a curse, said, "Konnichiwa." Professor Evans nodded, a genuine, unforced smile touching his lips. "Good," he said. "Thank you." He then wrote "thank you" and "arigato," and so it began. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. But the true psychological earthquake occurred outside the classroom. The American guards, many of them boys from farms and small towns, who had never seen an ocean before the war, had been issued small, government-printed phrasebooks. These were utilitarian tools, designed for basic camp administration, containing simple, functional phrases. Form a line. Report to the infirmary. Work detail this way. Stop. But the guards, influenced by the curious academic atmosphere of the classes, and perhaps their own innate, Midwestern neighborliness, began to experiment. They moved beyond the script. Private Miller, the Texan, became obsessed with mastering a single, inexplicable phrase, Daijōbu desu ka? Are you okay? He would practice it alone on watch, his southern drawl butchering the delicate syllables. Daijōbu desu ka? He repeated it like a mantra, a strange prayer in the cold air. One day, he saw Kenji, the fisherman, shivering violently without a proper coat, his thin prisoner uniform no match for the Wisconsin wind. Miller walked over, looked at him with a furrowed brow of concern, and asked, "Daijōbu desu ka?" Kenji stared at him, his mind refusing to process the data. The enemy was not just issuing a command. He was asking a question about his well-being. He was expressing a form of care. Kenji, stunned, managed a numb, slow nod. Miller, looking immensely pleased with himself, gave a clumsy thumbs up and walked away. Kenji stood frozen for a full minute, the simple question echoing in his mind, dismantling years of conditioning. Then he turned, bent over, and vomited into the snow. The violence of his physical reaction was a direct result of the violence done to his psyche. The guard's attempt had been clumsy, amateurish, almost childlike. But its intent had been undeniably, devastatingly humane. As the weeks passed, these linguistic overtures evolved from simple administration to something far more intimate and psychologically perilous. The Americans began to move beyond the phrasebook, attempting to learn words that reflected the inner lives, the memories, and the hearts of the prisoners. It started with names. The American guards, for efficiency and dehumanization, had initially referred to the prisoners by their camp numbers, but Private Miller started asking, "Namae wa nan desu ka?" What is your name? When a prisoner, shamed and reluctant, would mutter, "Tanaka," Miller would try to repeat it, tasting the word. "Tanaka-san," he would say, carefully adding the honorific "san" he had learned from Professor Evans, conveyed respect. To hear one's own name, spoken with a deliberate, respectful title, from the mouth of the enemy was a uniquely disorienting experience. It was a recognition of individual identity. They were no longer just a mass of Japs, faceless and interchangeable. They were Tanaka-san, Yamamoto-san, Kenji-san. This individualization was a direct assault on the collective, self-sacrificing identity, central to their imperial, military training. You cannot easily die for a collective when your enemy sees you as an individual. Then came the cultural references. Professor Evans, in his classes, began to incorporate more than just vocabulary. He was a cultural linguist at heart. He learned that many of the prisoners suffered from a deep, aching longing for rice, a staple that was as much psychological comfort as it was physical nourishment. He managed to secure a small supply from the camp kitchen, and one day he brought a single, steaming bowl to class. He held it up, the familiar scent filling the room, and said, "Rice, Gohan." The room fell into a stunned silence. He then asked, in his careful, formal Japanese, "Nihon de wa, kore o doyatte takimasu ka?" How do you cook this in Japan? The question was so mundane, so domestic, so utterly divorced from the context of war, captivity, and enemy status, that it broke through another layer of psychological defense. The prisoners, first hesitantly, then with growing passion, found themselves explaining about the precise washing of the rice, the importance of the right amount of water, the specific rice cookers used in their home prefectures, the shared, comforting meal with family. They were speaking of home, of peace, of normalcy to an American professor in a POW camp. The cognitive dissonance was physically dizzying for some. They were building a bridge of shared humanity with the very people they were supposed to hate. The most profound moment, however, came during a quiet, unobserved conversation between Sergeant Tanaka and Private Miller. Miller had been diligently trying to learn the days of the week. He pointed to the sky, one clear, bitterly cold evening, where a full moon was rising, brilliant and luminous, bathing the Wisconsin landscape in an ethereal silver light. "Moon," Miller said, pointing. "Tsuki," Tanaka replied, almost reflexively, the ancient word falling from his lips. Miller repeated the word, his accent still rough but improving. Then he looked at the moon, a massive cold pearl in the vastness of space, and said, in English, "Beautiful." He then looked at Tanaka, his face open and questioning, as if asking for the Japanese equivalent. Tanaka felt the word rise to his lips, a word tied to 1,000 poems, a million memories of moon viewing with his family. Utsukushi. Miller smiled, a slow, understanding smile, and nodded, looking back at the moon. Utsukushi, he repeated softly, reverently. In that shared moment, looking at the same moon that would be visible over their respective homes, over the wooden temples of Kyoto, and over the sprawling plains of Texas, the entire constructed reality of the war seemed to evaporate. They were not a Japanese sergeant and an American private. They were two human beings under the same ancient sky, acknowledging a universal beauty. Tanaka felt a sob well up in his throat, a wave of emotion so powerful and pure it terrified him. It was grief and joy and a crushing loneliness all at once. He had to turn and walk away, his vision blurring, the camp lights swimming in his tears. He wept not from sadness, but from the sheer, unbearable weight of this cosmic recognition. The enemy saw the same moon as beautiful. The enemy could learn the word for beautiful in his language. If that was true, then what was this war for? What were the millions of deaths for? The question was too terrifying, too vast to entertain, yet it now lived inside him, a constant, agonizing presence that gnawed at his soul. This cultural and linguistic fraternization did not go unchallenged within the prisoner population. A bitter, silent civil war erupted in the shadows of Camp McCoy, a conflict that pitted man against man, friend against friend, and conscience against sworn duty. Lieutenant Sato and his diehards saw the language exchanges as the gravest danger they had yet faced, worse than hunger, worse than cold. It was a poison for the spirit. They organized secret meetings in the latrine after lights out, their voices hushed but fervent. "They are using our own culture as a weapon," Sato would declare, his eyes burning with conviction. "Every word you teach them is a bullet they will use to kill your brothers on the front lines. Every moment of friendship is a betrayal of the emperor. They smile to hide the knife. They learn our language to learn how to destroy us more completely." His rhetoric was powerful because it was simple, and it fit the narrative they had all lived by for years. They began a campaign of subtle intimidation. A prisoner who was seen talking too long with a guard might find his few personal belongings: a carefully carved wooden bird, a letter from home, mysteriously vandalized. Those who attended English classes were shunned at mealtime, called Ainoko, half-breeds, or the more damning America no Ko, America's children. The message was clear. Fraternization was treason. The social pressure was immense. Kenji, the young fisherman, after his moment with Miller in the snow, had begun to tentatively enjoy the classes. He was a quick learner, and the mental exercise provided a welcome escape from the monotony of captivity. But after a diehard cornered him in the shower block and threatened in a low, venomous whisper that his family back in his village would be informed he was a collaborator, that they would be shamed and ostracized, he stopped attending. He confided in Tanaka later, his voice shaking with fear and guilt. "They said my mother would be spat on in the market. That my family name would be disgraced forever." Tanaka, torn between his own growing reluctant understanding and his duty as a sergeant to maintain unit cohesion and morale, was caught in an impossible position. He saw the value in the diehard's rigid loyalty. It was a familiar, sturdy fortress in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly complex. But he also could not unsee the unvarnished humanity in Private Miller's clumsy attempts to speak Japanese, or in Professor Evans's genuine, almost innocent scholarly interest. How could pure evil be so interested in the correct pronunciation of a seasonal poem. The conflict came to a head one evening during a particularly emotional class. Professor Evans was teaching family terms. He wrote father, Chichi, mother, haha, older brother, Annie. He then gently asked the prisoners if they would share the intimate, personal names they used for their parents at home. It was a deeply personal question, touching the most sacred, vulnerable part of a Japanese person's life, the family. The room was silent, the prisoners looking at their feet, the walls, anywhere but at the professor. The request felt like an intrusion into a sacred space. Then, a quiet, older prisoner named Isao, the one who had been helped with a knot months earlier, slowly stood up. His eyes were already glistening with unshed tears. He spoke, his voice thick with an emotion that had been suppressed for years. I call my mother Okaya-san. He paused, swallowing hard, the word hanging in the air, heavy with love and loss. Then he broke. I miss my Okaya-san, he cried, his voice cracking, great, heaving sobs shaking his frail body. I just want to see my Okaya-san again. The effect was electric, cathartic, and devastating. Other prisoners, their own rigid composure, shattered by his raw display, began to weep with him. The classroom was no longer a place of instruction. It was a gathering of grieving sons, of lost boys far from home. Professor Evans stood silently before them, his head bowed in respect, allowing the storm of emotion to pass. Even the 2 American guards stationed at the door looked away, shuffling their feet, uncomfortable and moved by the raw, universal display of human grief. In that moment, the diehard's ideology of unwavering stoicism and suppressed emotion collapsed under the weight of a simple, universal truth. You cannot order a man not to miss his mother. You cannot politicize that kind of primal, human pain. Tanaka, watching the scene, felt his own internal fortress, built of duty, honor, and racial superiority, crumble into dust. The Americans, by learning their language, had not stolen their culture. They had, paradoxically, given them a safe space to express it, to remember who they were before they were soldiers, before they were the emperor's warriors. They were helping them remember their own humanity. The shame of this realization and the gratitude for the space to grieve were intertwined. A psychological knot so complex and painful, he knew he might never untangle it. The power dynamic in the camp began to undergo a subtle but profound shift, creating a psychological landscape none of the prisoners had a map for. The Americans, the captors, the victors, had voluntarily placed themselves in the position of students. They were the ones making mistakes, mispronouncing words, looking foolish, and displaying vulnerability. This voluntary vulnerability was a form of psychological disarmament that the prisoners were completely unequipped to handle. How do you maintain hatred for someone who openly admits their ignorance and seeks your help? Private Miller, determined to master a full, complex sentence, approached Tanaka one afternoon during a lull in the work detail. Tanaka-san, he said, holding his dog-eared phrasebook open to a well-thumbed page. How do you say, "The weather is very cold today"? Tanaka, almost against his will, found himself slipping into the role of instructor. He corrected Miller's grammar and pronunciation, patiently modeling the correct phrase. Kyo wa totemo samui desu. Miller repeated it, his accent still thick, but his effort and concentration palpable. When he finally got it approximately right, he smiled, a bright, unguarded, triumphant smile. Thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu, Tanaka-san. In that moment, Tanaka was no longer just a prisoner being managed. He was a sensei, a teacher. The hierarchical structure of his world which placed the armed American guard in a position of absolute power, was inverted. He, the prisoner, held a form of power, knowledge, cultural knowledge, that the American needed and had respectfully requested. This was infinitely more confusing than being dominated. How could one hate a student? How could one despise someone who looked at you with the eager, frustrated, and ultimately grateful eyes of a learner? The very concept of enemy was becoming blurred, replaced by the more complicated reality of person. The guards began to ask questions that went far beyond the practical and into the philosophical. "What is that festival?" one asked, pointing to a detailed drawing a prisoner had made of a summer matsuri with its paper lanterns and dancing figures. "Why do you take your shoes off inside?" another wondered aloud, genuinely perplexed by the cultural reflex. "What does this symbol mean?" a third asked, pointing to a kanji character for harmony. They were asking, in essence, who are you? What do you value? What makes your culture unique? And in asking, they were implicitly acknowledging that the prisoners were a people with a history, an aesthetics, a philosophy, a depth worth understanding. This curiosity was a form of respect that was more corrosive to hatred than any propaganda leaflet. This cultural curiosity reached its peak during a spontaneous, unplanned poetry session. Sergeant Tanaka, in a moment of profound aching homesickness, had used a stick to trace a haiku into the hard-packed dirt of the exercise yard during a work detail. It was a classic, melancholic verse by Basho that he had modified slightly. Furu yuki no, hate wa furusato, omoide ka. The falling snows, end is my hometown, or just a memory. A guard, Corporal James, the same granite-faced man who had taught Kenji to shovel snow, saw the characters etched in the earth. He did not scuff them out with his boot. Instead, he stopped and stared. He could not read them, but he recognized the deliberate artistic form. He called for Professor Evans. The professor came, brushed the snow from his glasses, and peered down at the poem. He read it silently, then asked Tanaka to explain its meaning. Haltingly at first, then with growing passion, Tanaka spoke of how the endless Wisconsin snowscape reminded him of the winters of his childhood in Kyoto, but the memory was so distant it felt like a dream. He spoke of the poem's essence, the blurring line between memory and reality, the longing for a home that might no longer exist as he remembered it. Professor Evans listened, nodded with deep understanding, and then translated the essence, the feeling of the poem, for Corporal James. James, a man of few words, looked at the poem in the dirt, then at Tanaka, and gave a slow, single, respectful nod. No words were needed. The poem had been seen. It had been understood. Its beauty and its sadness had been acknowledged. For a writer, for a man of letters like Tanaka, this was the most profound form of recognition possible. The enemy had not just tolerated his culture, they had appreciated his art. He felt, in that moment, more seen and understood by the simple American corporal than he had by his own military commanders, who saw poetry as a frivolous distraction from the business of dying for the emperor. The emotional impact was vertiginous. He had shared his soul with the enemy, and the enemy had not mocked it. They had honored it. The culmination of this prolonged psychological campaign was not a single, dramatic event, but a series of quiet, personal, internal collapses that happened in the hearts and minds of the prisoners. Their resistance, once as rigid and sharp as the camp's barbed wire, had been corroded by a constant, dripping stream of human connection, facilitated by the bridge of language. For Kenji, The final surrender happened when he overheard Private Miller practicing Japanese, alone in the freezing guard tower. Miller was trying to construct a complex sentence. "I hope your family is safe in Japan." He kept getting the grammar wrong, muttering the phrases over and over into the cold, still air, his breath forming plumes of steam, his voice frustrated but determined. "Anata no kazoku ni Nihon de anzen." The sheer, futile, profound kindness of the effort, the fact that this young American boy, himself thousands of miles from home, was spending his lonely watch trying to express a sentiment of compassion and hope for the family of his enemy, was the final straw for Kenji. The wall of hatred he had been taught to build and maintain had no foundation. It was built on a lie, and this simple, persistent kindness was the truth that washed it all away. He slid down the wall of his barracks and cried, not the silent, stoic tears of a soldier, but the helpless, ragged sobs of a child who has just realized the world is not as simple or as cruel as he was told. For Lieutenant Sato, the die-hard leader, his collapse was slower, more insidious, and far more terrifying. He was a man whose identity was entirely built upon the framework of his ideology. He watched as his men, one by one, began to soften. He saw them patiently teaching guards how to write their names in kanji, their hands guiding the Americans' clumsy fingers. He heard them sharing stories about their hometowns, their faces animated with a light he had not seen since before the war. His power, based on fear and rigid dogma, was waning. One evening, he could bear it no longer. He confronted Professor Evans directly after a class, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and a terrifying confusion. "Nays?" he demanded in Japanese, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this? Why do you pretend to care about our language? What is your real purpose?" Professor Evans, who had by now learned enough Japanese to understand the core of the anguish behind the words, replied in calm, measured English, which a nervous interpreter translated. "I am not a soldier, Lieutenant. I am a teacher. A language is not just a collection of words for things. It is a window. It is a window into how a people see the world, what they value, what they fear, what they love. I want to see how you see the world. That is all. There is no other purpose." The simplicity, the honesty, and the profound truth of the answer disarmed Sato completely. This was not a military strategy. It was intellectual curiosity. It was, at its root, a fundamental expression of humanity. He had prepared his entire being to fight an enemy who wanted to destroy him. He did not know how to fight an enemy who wanted to understand him. The fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped, the fire in his eyes extinguished, not by defeat, but by a clarity he could not refute. He walked away from the encounter, a broken man, his fanaticism replaced by a hollow, bewildered silence. When the news of Japan's surrender finally reached the camp, the prisoners' reaction was complex and layered. There was, of course, a profound grief for their nation, a deep shame for their defeat, a terrifying uncertainty about the future. But for many, woven through the despair, there was also a strange, grim sense of relief. The war was over. The cognitive dissonance could end. They no longer had to be Japanese soldiers facing an American enemy. They could just be men, Akira, Kenji, Izao, who had survived something incomprehensible. As they prepared for repatriation, the goodbyes were awkward, fraught with unspoken emotions that no phrasebook could adequately capture. Private Miller sought out Tanaka. "Tanaka-san," he said, his Japanese still clumsy but unbearably earnest. "Ite kimasu," and "Kiyotsukete." I will go and come back, and take care. He had used the phrases a person uses when leaving their own home, wishing safety to those who remain behind. Tanaka looked at the young American, this boy who had unknowingly been the primary agent of his psychological destruction and his painful, reluctant reconstruction. He felt a surge of emotion that had no name. He bowed, deeply and formally, a bow of respect from one man to another. "Itarashai, Miller-san," he replied, his voice thick. "Go and come back safely." It was the response given to a member of one's own household, a ritualistic exchange of care. As Tanaka turned to board the ship that would take him back to a defeated, devastated, and occupied Japan, he did not weep for his lost cause or his fallen emperor. He wept for the impossible, heartbreaking humanity he had found in the last place he ever expected to find it. The Americans had not just learned their language. They had learned how to speak to their souls, and in doing so, they had won a victory that no battlefield, no bomb, and no general could ever claim. The story of Camp McCoy's language program is a forgotten masterpiece of psychological warfare, precisely because it was never intended as warfare at all. It was an emergent property of basic human curiosity, meeting basic human need. In the crucible of captivity, a simple phrasebook became more powerful than a regiment of soldiers, and a linguistics professor proved more effective than a general. The former prisoners returned to Japan carrying a double burden: the national shame of defeat and the deeply personal, conflicted memory of an enemy's unexpected respect. Many, like Tanaka, never fully readjusted. They were strangers in their own land, men who understood with painful clarity that the world was more complicated, more nuanced, and more interconnected than the simplistic us versus them ideologies of war would ever allow. Tanaka, using the English he had learned from Professor Evans, found work as a translator during the American occupation. He became a bridge, a reluctant but essential interpreter between two cultures that had so recently tried to annihilate each other. He would sometimes see the confusion in the eyes of his new Japanese colleagues who could not understand his lack of bitterness. He never tried to explain it fully. How could he convey that his hatred had been dismantled not by defeat, but by a Texan's mispronounced greeting and a shared glance at the moon? Private David Miller returned to his ranch in Texas. He never forgot the Japanese words he had learned, or the serious, intelligent sergeant who had taught him. The war, for him, was not just a story of combat, but of a strange, formative friendship, forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Professor Evans returned to the University of Chicago, where he would later write a seminal, obscure paper on linguistic exchange in captivity and its psychological effects, a work largely ignored by the military but cherished by anthropologists. The ultimate lesson of Camp McCoy is that the most resilient and impenetrable fortresses are not made of stone or steel, but of ideology, identity, and manufactured hatred. And the most effective way to breach those walls is not with a siege of counter-propaganda, but with an invitation to shared understanding. The American Guards, with their mispronounced greetings and their clumsy, earnest questions, did not attack the Japanese identity. They invited it to step outside its defensive walls and into the shared, vulnerable, and common ground of human communication. In the end, the Japanese soldiers did not weep simply because the Americans learned their language. They wept because in the enemy's attempt to speak their words, they saw a reflection of their own humanity, a humanity their military training had taught them to deny in themselves and in their foes. They were broken open by kindness, by curiosity, by respect. And in that breaking, they were remade. The tears they shed were not just of sorrow or confusion. They were the baptismal waters of a new, more painful, but ultimately more truthful and complete understanding of the world and the people in it. It was a victory not of arms, but of the human spirit, and its echo is a lesson that resonates through the decades, waiting to be heard again.